Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast. As many of our regular listeners and viewers will know, we are shortly, in about 4 weeks from when this is being recorded, shortly attending and launching the first Fully Charged live show in British Columbia, in Vancouver, British Columbia, and we are very excited about it. No question of that. We've had, as always, when we do a new show, like last year, we did the first time we did a show in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, and that was it was a struggle to get there, but it worked, and that was great relief that it worked. And we know that this year's show in Amsterdam is going to be, I think it's literally 3 times bigger. So people get it then once they've seen it. The first show we did in the United States in Austin, Texas was like a struggle to get there, but eventually it worked and we've gone on and made bigger shows. The first show we did in Sydney, Australia last year was way, way above anything that we could have possibly expected. We had so many more people attending because there's huge interest in the topics we cover. And what we've now discovered in British Columbia, in Vancouver, is that we have actually surpassed what happened to us in Sydney. So there's more people coming. There's way more cars on display. A lot of cars being unveiled at the event. For the first time, they'll be seen on the North American continent anywhere, which is really exciting. And this has all happened in the last few weeks. So today's episode is very, very relevant to that because we're talking about what is happening in British Columbia, what has been going on with the forest fires and with the hydroelectric systems and their onshore wind and their new distribution lines. Really, some really interesting stuff. So I'm not going to go on about it now. All I would love you to do is, if you are of a mind, is to give us some nice reviews. That's really made a difference to the podcast. We've really had a noticeable big increase in the number of downloads on the audio-only version, and a slight, nice, gentle increase on the YouTube versions. So however you get your podcast, if you can leave a nice review, particularly if you use a podcast download application, give us a 5-star review or whatever you want. Just be honest. Just tell us what you think of these podcasts. It really makes a difference to us, helps us focus on where we should be looking. We've got lots of plans for the podcast in the coming year. Lots of stuff about doing some episodes where we have regular, what do you call it? Guests? No, people who talk. You know what I mean. Anyway, today's guest is it's just so lovely talking to Canadians. Let's be honest. It's very hard to be offended by a Canadian. I'm sure there's Canadians that are horrible. I'm sure, but I haven't met them. All the Canadians I've ever met have been lovely. So today we're going to talk to Chris O'Reilly, who is the CEO of BC Hydro, from his office in Vancouver. And it is a fascinating conversation. And I'll join you very briefly at the end for a quick roundup with a couple of bits of information about Fully Charged Live Vancouver. But in the meantime, please welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast, Chris O'Reilly. Chris, thank you very much for your time today to record this. Well, I've got to say the team here in the UK are very excited about coming to Vancouver.
Oh, great.
The show is looking amazing, which is a real thrill because it's always a bit of a struggle to do the first show in a new part of the world. And we have surpassed all our previous records of how many people are coming and how many things are on display there and how big the event is and the speakers that are appearing, including yourself, which is really exciting. But aside from all that, we did speak last year about what's happening in British Columbia. And I think since we knew we were coming there, we've become more and more aware of what British Columbia is doing. And we've always said in the past, oh, look at Norway. They're amazing. They have so much renewable energy and they have so many electric. We go on and on about Norway. Meanwhile, what's happening in British Columbia is equally, if not more impressive in terms of your energy system. It's extraordinary. I mean, would you mind going through the sort of basics of what BC Hydro does, how much electricity you generate, where it goes? Because those facts are really, really impressive.
Yes, it is a really impressive system. So we have about 12,000 megawatts of generation, about 55,000 gigawatt hours or 55 terawatt hours of annual consumption here in British Columbia. We cover almost the entire province as the utility. We have 4 million customers. Almost all of our energy is what we call clean, which means non-carbon emitting. We have a very small amount of natural gas that we're in the process of phasing out, like other utilities around the world. Most of our generation is hydroelectric generation, and that we have in common with Norway. But we have a growing proportion of wind and solar as well. So we have 10 wind farms of varying sizes, and we actually have about 7,500 rooftop solar installations among our customers, what we call net metering accounts, and a few utility scale solar installations as well. So we're really proud of the clean energy system we have here in British Columbia and our role in the energy transition.
But then the other one that I think is fascinating is the adoption of heat pumps. So are you in a process of sort of because what is the, I think you've told me this before, but the good thing is my memory is so bad I can't remember what you said, but what the sort of most common form of home heating is, like it would have been in Canada in the last 20 years.
Yes, well, natural gas has a big role in heating across Canada and still here in British Columbia. We have a growing number of heat pumps coming on the system, and customers are finding those attractive because they're inherently more efficient because they draw heat from the atmosphere. And of course, when they're powered by clean electricity, they're non-emitting. So we are seeing a growing utilization of heat pumps, and the governments here, as well as BC Hydro, we have incentives that we're offering customers to help make that transition.
Right. Because actually one of the companies I've spoken to recently in Canada is Bondi Energy, who retrofit large apartment buildings. Because it's one of those things, whenever I think of a heat pump, all the ones I've seen have been in a single occupancy house, like a house. But they're talking about big tower blocks with 200 apartments. And they're fitting them on there, which is fantastic that's happening. And I know they did mention they're doing some projects in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really important, I think, to get new construction enabled with heat pumps or installed with heat pumps. And we're seeing more moves to transitioning the building codes to drive that. And, it's the old story of when you're in a hole, stop digging. So we'd like to avoid installing new fossil fuel infrastructure and get heat pumps installed from the start. But we are seeing a growing adoption of the technology here, and customers like it and are keen for more.
But then in the sort of terms of the big picture over, say, the next 20, 25 years, say you if you electrify the majority of home heating, and then if you electrify the majority of ground transport in British Columbia, have you kind of done calculations as to how much more you need to generate and whether you've got the capacity to do that, and will it really use that much more, and all those arguments that I hear, we've heard for years?
Yeah, that's a real point of debate here and in jurisdictions around the world. I'm sure you're picking up on that. Yeah. So we're in the midst of a long-term planning process right now, and we're forecasting out to 2040 and 2050, and we feel the amount of additional electricity that's required is manageable and can be brought online over time. It does take time to make these transitions, and particularly when you're talking about turnover in electric vehicles, or in the vehicle fleet and in the furnace fleet. I mean, people don't toss their current infrastructure out, their current equipment out overnight, and so I think we have the ability to respond. One thing we are seeing is quite an interest in locating industrial customers here in British Columbia, and we have a broad range and probably a deeper hopper of potential large industrial projects than I've ever seen. And a number of those are related to energy transition, whether they be mining, projects that are, there's a lot of interest in critical minerals and copper and such to drive feed the energy transition. And there's a number of mining projects here. We're also seeing more and more what we call clean tech projects. So projects that would create hydrogen in different ways, including hydrolysis, that is quite electricity intensive. And we are seeing a potential there. There's also quite a bit of natural gas production in British Columbia. Again, something we share with Norway, in that they produce a lot of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And natural gas is seen as a transition fuel in many parts of the world. So there's a growing market for exports of natural gas, and we're trying to produce that in the lowest emission way possible, which includes using electrification for both the production and processing, as well as the liquefaction and export of it. So there are scenarios where our demand, our load, as we call it, just grows dramatically, and we're trying to manage in that uncertainty, and that in itself is causing us some planning challenges. We are fortunate that we have a major hydroelectric dam coming into service, and I think we talked about that last time. That's the Site C dam, which represents an 8% addition to our supply.
Wow!
And which normally would be quite significant. But we are seeing scenarios where we would run through that quite quickly.
Right.
We also recently announced a new call for renewable power, which would add another 5% to our supply, and that would most likely be wind and solar resources, which would kind of pair quite nicely with our existing flexible hydroelectric system. So we are working to ensure we have enough, given the growing appetite we're seeing from our customers for electrification.
Yeah. And I mean, the other way that, Canada in general, but also British Columbia in particular, got in the news globally recently was your huge forest fires you had.
Yes.
And I did then wonder, I sort of read a report about it, and it was really shocking, and it was obviously a very traumatic thing for anyone who lives near there. But I first heard about it from friends who live in New York, who said, look at the picture outside their window, which I knew their house, and it was sort of orange. And I said, oh my God, have you got forest fires there? They live in just outside New York. And they went, no, it's in Canada. I mean, that was shocking. But then what then occurred to me was, if you've had I just wonder about your water supply after being after seeing one of your hydroelectric plants in this vast lake, and then going, well, can that go down if there's no rain?
Yes.
But you're not suffering from water shortages in that sense?
Well, so first of all, I want to acknowledge the forest fires in Canada this summer have been terrible, and I think off the charts compared to historic levels, and really across the country. And one thing you get a sense of is if you've flown across Canada and you just see how big the country is and how vast the forests are. Sometimes you get suggestions that we should be clearing the undergrowth in forests and to prevent forest fires. And I don't think people have a sense of how big this country is. And
you might need about 10 million people with rakes.
So that isn't going to happen. And you end up with these just very, very large fires in the north, quite remote from people and settlements, but very impactful to the environment. And the smoke is North America wide. So it has extended down to Chicago and New York. And it's a bad day when the New York Times is talking about the forest fires and in Canada on the front page. And so we've had here in British Columbia, we've had the biggest, we've had the worst season in recorded history. And we've had the biggest fire that has been recorded in modern history going on in the north, quite remote from where most of the people live, but very impactful in terms of smoke. And I think we should acknowledge the terrible fire that occurred in Hawaii last week, and just awful.
Shocking.
Lots of people in Vancouver. We all have ties and have spent time in Maui, and just horrific to see the damage and the loss of life there, and just a reminder how fragile our existence here and how impacted we can be from climate change.
Excuse me.
But
So,
you asked about the water conditions, and we are experiencing a drought here in Western Canada, and that's something we do have to manage. When you have a hydroelectric system, you have to deal with the fact that the amount of precipitation you get each year and the amount of inflows to your system vary, and we're at the low end of the range we've seen. It is manageable for now, but we'll be more comfortable for sure when the rains start again, as they always do here in BC, and that will help both our fuel situation as well as take the pressure off the forest fires.
Right. And I mean, presumably some of your storage is from, I'm just guessing, is from snow melting in the winter. I mean, is that you? I mean, and so I suppose that depends how much snow you're getting and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we had a relatively low snowpack last year. That's what we call the accumulation of snow. And so that has contributed to lower reservoir levels and drier conditions in the forest. And that's really it really sets the conditions for the forest fire forest fire conditions that we've had this year. So we are hoping for a return to more normal precipitation in the fall and a good accumulation of snow over the winter. And we do see that variability from year to year, and typically you get you go through a bad year and you get a more normal year. That's what we've come to be used to, but we're very wary of how that could change with climate change, and we're tracking that very closely, and lots of work going into understanding the science of what climate change means at a more localized on a more localized basis, which is what you need to understand when it comes to forecasting inflows into a reservoir or a hydroelectric basin.
Yeah. Because, I mean, that was the rather shocking thing from my ignorance of Hawaii and Maui in particular. I've never heard of forest fires there before. I mean, maybe they do have. I mean, if someone said, "Oh, there's a forest fire in Canada," I'm not that surprised. Having been to Canada, having seen how huge the forests are, that's not quite. But somehow I assumed Maui and Hawaii was kind of tropical rainforest, wet, damp, green, dripping on you when you walk through it. And the fact that those fires were, I know there was grasses that were blamed up to a point, but still, it's an island in the middle of the Pacific.
Yeah.
It should be really wet.
Yes. Yeah. And it's just, I mean, it's an indication of what's changing around us and the urgency. I'm always struck by, we used to talk about climate change, the impacts of climate change in the context of 2050 and 2100. And I think the last 3 or 4 years, we've realized it's not a future problem; it's a current problem, and we've had some quite extreme weather here in British Columbia, including a very significant flood event in November 2021 that we probably talked about last time.
Yes, yeah.
We've had a series of bad forest fire years. We've had a growing frequency of big windstorms here, so we're feeling the fragility of life here on the west coast of North America, and I think that is feeding our collective desire to do more when it comes to fighting climate change.
Because that was a story that I don't know. I've seen a headline and read a little bit about because it made me think of when I spoke to you today, a leaking hydroelectric dam in Norway, which caused some flooding or something. Do you know about? I don't really know the full story, but I mean, it made me go, "Oh my God!" All these other issues around hydroelectric dams.
Well, I don't know the details around that, but I think we don't like the word leaking and dam in the same sentence. So I'm sure they're on that. I'm sure they're taking that very seriously, as we would here. It's really, when in our industry, the safety of dams is really important to give people confidence who live downstream and work around rivers. So that's always very serious topic in utilities, something we take seriously, and I know they do in Norway.
Yeah, they would do in Norway.
Yeah, for sure.
No, it's just, I think it was after I went to Revelstoke, I was so blown away by the scale of it and the technology, everything about it was just overwhelming. But then when you do think of that, you go, oh goodness, because I do know when I stood at the bottom, there's this wall that towers up above
Yes.
you. You know, behind that wall is quite a lot of water.
Yes. Well, we take that
But
responsibility very seriously,
yeah, I'm
for
sure.
sure.
No, and rightly, no, absolutely right. But so what? I mean, what are there? What would you say are the biggest challenges then that BC Hydro face in the next 20 years? Is
Mhm.
it generation, or is it distribution, or is it rising demand? I mean, it sounds like it's a combination of all those. But what?
Yeah. Well, we've had, like many utilities, we've had an electrification plan for a few years. We're in the
Right,
second year of our first 5-year electrification plan, and that is a customer-based plan where we're helping our customers make different decisions around the use of energy and using electricity in place of fossil fuels, and that helps them meet their their own emission reductions targets. And I think when we got into it, it felt a little bit like we were pushing rope uphill,
right,
and it was a bit of a hard sell because in many cases fossil fuels are quite a bit cheaper
yeah,
and easier and quite entrenched in our economy
yeah,
and in our society in many ways. And I think we're seeing that change, and there is more desire and more pressing and urgent desire to switch to electricity. And when you look at our climate plan in British Columbia, it's called the Clean BC plan. There's actually a whole range of pathways in the climate plan to reduce emissions, including beyond electrification, including
right,
things like building efficiency, um, uh, reducing the emissions content or the carbon content in the natural gas stream through things like renewable natural gas and putting hydrogen in. We have a big plan around developing a hydrogen energy system here
right,
in British Columbia, as many jurisdictions do. There's included in the plan are negative emission technologies, so ways of getting emissions out of the atmosphere, sequestration. And I think what we're experiencing is that electrification is the most available pathway that our customers have to reduce emissions. It's the thing they can do today, and a number of those other pathways are looking further and further down the road. So we're certainly feeling the expectations among our customers and broader society rising, and that is causing us to take more urgent action around adding supply at the generation level, ensuring that we have the wires, the
yeah,
transmission and distribution system, the stations to get the power where it's needed. So as I said, we've announced a call for power from the private sector, from the renewable energy sector, to add generation. We've expanded our capital plan, which mostly goes into the wires, um, and we're likely to do that again in the
right,
fall. We've announced a process to twin or add a second major transmission line on a pathway from central British Columbia out to the Pacific coast in the
right,
north, and that is to feed a whole range of industries, ranging from mining and natural gas to ports, and some of that is expansion, some of it's electrification. So we are seized of the challenge to meet the growing expectations in the province, and trying to come at these problems in different ways to ensure
yeah,
the infrastructure's there. And maybe the biggest thing that makes that hard is really just the uncertainty around what we're aiming for.
yeah,
Because when you add all the potential uses of electricity, whether it's electrifying existing applications or adding new industries and new applications and whole new industries, like I said, around the clean tech and things like hydrogen production, there is quite a range of
yeah,
demand for electricity, and potentially quite close in, relative to our planning cycles. This is an industry that plans in 10 and 20-year increments,
yes,
and
yeah,
and we're talking about loads that could come on, in 5 to 7 years. So those
yeah,
are that uncertainty and that planning challenge is probably the biggest thing that we're dealing
yeah.
with here.
And I mean, that's one of the things I've really been aware of the last sort of 10 years or so is the speed of change of the technologies we're using. That it felt like, I don't know what, 15 years ago, if you had a conference about the energy system anywhere in the world, it would be fairly, we generate here, we transmit it down these lines, then that goes to a substation, and then that goes out. It was a set up system that worked, might rely on fossil fuels, but it was functioning. And then suddenly all that's kind of thrown. I mean, as you were saying, like there's new industries coming that literally wouldn't have existed
Yes.
8-10 years ago. They no one, not even on paper, and they've now emerged, and they need materials and they need energy, and because that the part of British Columbia I realize I'm supremely unaware of is the North Coast.
Yes.
Because I have been to Vancouver and Vancouver Island, and I only know the bottom little corner. There's this huge country, in the north. So that's where, as you're saying, there's quite a lot of mining and natural gas. Or that's generally up in that area, is it?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. The north is quite obviously sparsely populated, vast distances. We talk about areas the size of France, right? That fit nicely within the province.
Yeah.
And but lots of potential development, and I think a really interesting feature of that is the role of Indigenous people and First Nations, as we call them here in Canada, being part of that development. There's an Indigenous-owned LNG export facility that's being planned. They haven't made a final commitment yet, but that would be among the and that's being done fully electrified. So that would be on its own the largest load that we've had in our system, and that would be on
just
the
that
North
one
Coast. That one facility would be the largest single site that we have. And there's quite an interest among First Nations to be part of the energy sector, the clean energy sector. We're with this power line that I talked about that we're working on to supply the North Coast. We've proposed that be 50% owned by First Nations. There's 14 First Nation communities along the path, and we're working with them to design an ownership model where we would develop that in partnership. And that's just really about coming at the problem of development in different ways, trying to get alignment of interests and get things built more quickly, right? As well as, meet the commitments that we have under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has been adopted here in British Columbia. It's one of the first jurisdictions in the world that have adopted it, and are incorporating it in legislation. So we are trying to come at the development problem differently and create some different benefits and different outcomes.
I mean, that is so good to hear when you think of the kind of trauma of pipelines that went across Indigenous areas in North America, and the fights and the resistance and all that stuff, all that turmoil. And if you actually, I mean, that's different. I'm not trying to compare a crude oil pipeline with an electricity network, but just the notion of a completely different approach to go, look, we need this for the big picture, but the small picture is you're here, this is where you live, and these wires are going, why don't you own it? Just makes an enormous.
Well, I think if you're not involved, if you're a First Nation and you're not involved in it, a power line and a crude oil pipeline kind of look the same, right?
I guess they do.
They're infrastructure that people have come from away and put on your land, and we're just trying to change that dynamic. And so far it seems very positive. Like no one's saying don't build it. No one's saying we shouldn't be electrifying. We shouldn't be growing our grid. Everyone's aligned with that. It's just really about how we make it happen, how we reflect Indigenous values in the construction of the line. How we make decisions around the environmental regulation and such, and how we ensure that benefits flow to communities. So it's remarkable. We've got more. We agree on more at this point, I think, than we disagree on.
Right.
And it's really about the details of how we make it happen.
And I mean, when you describe those power lines. I mean, I'm imagining sort of large. We call them pylons in this country. I don't know if that's
Yes.
what you call them. With wires hanging up, going across hundreds of, probably in your case, many hundreds of miles. But is that still what you will be building? You're not burying the cables underground or anything like that. It is still, they're still up in the air.
Yes, they're on towers,
Right.
pylons, if you
Yeah.
will, and they stretch across. I mean, it's just a vast
Yeah.
territory, by any comparison, and so we are doing them overhead. We use cables underwater cables for water
Right.
crossings and such, but generally, it doesn't make sense to bury
Right. So that
electrical.
it does seem strange that it is more expensive. I presume more expensive to bury it than it is to
Oh, it is
have it
much
on.
more expensive to
Right.
bury.
Because you think.
Almost, sometimes you hear, well, it's multiples more
Right.
expensive.
Well, because you think that construction of all those towers, I mean, there's lots of them. You
Yeah.
think that would be more expensive, but clearly that's not the case.
Yeah, no. And you know what? You end up with losses, they call it. And the losses are reduced when you raise the lines away from the ground. And
Oh, wow.
one of the reasons they're on the towers is it reduces the losses that
Right.
occur. Yeah. So
Wow.
that's a kind of a detail. But
Yeah. Because
and what we're trying to do with recognizing that there's a significant footprint to a
Yeah.
line like that when you multiply the width of the line by the
Yeah.
length, and there's a lot of trees that have to be cut down. So there is an existing line there, and we're trying very hard to run the second line in parallel.
Right.
We call it along the existing corridor, and that will minimize the environmental impacts and fragmentation that occurs from that. And that's a well accepted, mitigation technique
Yeah.
by environmentalists and First Nations as well. So there seems to be support for that.
But then the reason you've got to do that, presumably, then I'm guessing at this, that you've got large generation systems in more central British Columbia, in the mountainous regions.
Yes.
That's where the reservoirs and the dams are and the hydroelectric plant. And you've got to transmit that energy across, I don't know what, a large distance then to the coast.
Yes.
So, right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And we are hoping with the growing improvements in the wind generation technology that can be located in different places and create some diversity in our system from a location perspective.
Right.
We most of the wind generation in all of the wind generation today and what we see coming is what we call onshore or on land. And I know in Europe, you've got a lot more offshore wind generation. We've not seen that here yet.
Right.
Mostly because it's quite expensive and quite remote from the load centers. So there's quite a lot of transmission costs to connect offshore wind here in British Columbia to the grid. And so far it hasn't those kind of proposals have not been successful. But
also,
maybe down the road.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I do understand about our offshore wind, particularly around the UK, is that we've got a lot of very shallow sea, which I don't know if you have, because you can go, well, they should do this in Japan. Well, around Japan, there's like a beach and a cliff, and it's really, really deep straight away, but they don't have the same topography as we. I don't know.
We've mostly we have some shallow areas like that in the north, but where those are, they're a long way from the grid, and so you have different costs. So I think that the attraction of offshore wind in places like Europe and in the eastern coast of the United States is the turbines are actually relatively close to the major cities and what we call loads. That's how we describe cities are loads to us.
Yeah.
And so you save on the transmission. So we don't have that. We don't have that dynamic here in British Columbia, just based on the geography. And so it's a different challenges.
But then, so let's go back to cars, because that's definitely going to be a feature of the show in Vancouver, electric vehicles. Is from what I can tell, British Columbia has about the highest adoption of electric vehicles in Canada. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So we track every quarter both the number of cars that are on the road, electric cars, and the percentage of new car sales that are electric. And I think the last quarter we got up to 18%
Right.
of vehicle sales were electric.
Wow.
And
That's impressive.
which is I understand among the highest in the world.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that continuing to grow. We're seeing, some of the supply chain challenges that, we've all heard about seem to be easing on the electric vehicle side, and there's more models and more availability, and the prices have even, we're hearing the prices coming down as well.
Yeah.
So we anticipate a continued development or continued adoption of electric vehicles. We're planning, so we have about 100,000, 108,000, I think now, and we're planning for 650,000 by 2030.
Right.
And there's obviously a range around that, but that's what we're planning for. And we think that's manageable from a system perspective, and both in terms of the generation. Just for comparison, our Site C dam would support 1.7 million electric vehicles. So
just that one dam. That's
so
amazing.
That the figure by 2030 would be about a third of that. If we achieve that number. There's also impacts on the grid as well, and the need for chargers around the system. In terms of the grid, we're bringing out a time of use rate, an optional rate that is intended to encourage customers to charge their vehicles at night, and we think there's a real desire to do that. And if we can achieve a high rate of overnight charging versus on peak charging, then that makes it a lot more manageable, and something we can deal with, and something really important, that we make better use of the grid we have, even as we expand and build it out. And then we have our own commitment to build out the charging network. So we've got a fast charging network that's being built out along the major corridors, transportation corridors, and we've got about 150 of our own chargers at about 85 or so locations, and we're continuing to build that out, and while also supporting the private sector and individuals in putting in their own chargers. So I think we're trying to match the growth in vehicles with a investment in the charging network, and avoid that, the range anxiety that is a barrier to some in terms of their own EVs.
Yeah, I mean, that's it, because I think now I think range anxiety has been finally replaced, because it's always slightly annoyed me because the only thing I've ever run out of in my life is diesel. Which is really embarrassing. It was my fault. But that's range anxiety, when you're stuck on the side of the road. People go, "Well, you can fill it up with a can." I didn't have a can, but anyway, that's another story. But
I think it's just something you have to meet people where they are, right? And that's something you have to overcome. And I personally had only positive experience with my EV.
But I mean, it is. I think it is charger. I think now, particularly in this country, charger anxiety is very legitimate. I.e., there's a charger there, you get there and it doesn't work. That is really, really bad. That's
really frustrating.
That's a bad experience. Which is getting better in this country, but it certainly has been an issue. And I think it's just that as the technology develops, it was that side of it's getting.
Yeah, they're very complicated devices, actually. And there's quite a it's a demanding task to funnel that much electricity, convert it to a DC form, and get it into a vehicle in a very short period of time. So probably not surprising, some of the equipment
some of them don't work.
Struggled with that.
The thing we've learned from the charging companies rather than the car companies, although now the car companies are eventually acknowledging that they may have made mistakes, is the charger is fine. The car doesn't communicate correctly with it, which throws and actually it's the cars that have messed it up. But I think we'll get there. I mean, I think we may have discussed this before, but I think you noticed a drop in demand in 2020 during COVID and all that stuff. And it took, because that seems to be universal around the world. It was quite slow coming back, but from what I can gather now, we're back to normal. I mean, it's kind of
Oh yes,
yeah,
we're back to normal, and I think more quickly than we were anticipating.
right,
Yeah,
right,
so it's it's probably a statement about human nature, the
yeah,
desire for normalcy, and that's reflected in the economy and the activities people are undertaking, and
right,
even the the transition to remote work. I think we've kind of normalized that,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and so we're seeing from an electrical perspective, we saw the economy bounce back very nicely.
right,
There was lots of talk about a recession, and so far that hasn't happened yet. We've
right,
seemed to be seeing inflation coming down nicely here in North America and Canada,
yeah,
and conditions are are more normal, I think, than we were expecting. So that's
right.
great.
I don't want to say anything about my own country, but I think you're
Yeah.
quite lucky. I don't want to go into that detail. But one of the things that intrigues me then is my very brief visit many years ago to Vancouver Island. Is that would you just consider that as part of your network? Because it felt like it's off the coast. It's a different because it's huge. I thought Vancouver Island was going to be like a little island till I got
Yeah.
there and I went, oh my god, this is big.
Yeah.
But
It's
that's
a
just part
yeah.
of your network. It's not
Part
any
of our
big deal.
system. Yeah. I mean, we have, it's got its challenges with an island. We have apparently more um, underwater cables connecting different islands than
Right.
I want to say than any other utility, maybe any other
Okay.
utility in
Wow.
North America.
So,
But
yeah, that's what
we
I
have
was
a
going to ask.
lot of we have a
Yeah.
lot of underwater cables is the
Right.
way I would say that, and most of the electricity that is used on Vancouver Island comes from the mainland. So we
Right.
are currently in the early stages of planning another cable to the island
Right.
in anticipation of growth. And um, just it's just part of
Yeah.
one of the challenges we manage
Yeah.
in a mountainous community on the coast
Yeah.
of North America. It's
Yeah.
part of what makes BC special, and
Yeah.
one more challenge we have to deal with is islands.
Because that was the thing when you mentioned about car charging. One of the things I thought of, I've understood over the years why electricity can be very cheap at night, very cheap to
Mhm.
generate. So we're now looking at often at night time, we're looking at 60-70% of the electricity that is
Yes.
generated is from wind. So it's very, very cheap. And that's why we can have these sort of
Mhm.
variable tariffs. But in a sense, with hydroelectric, presumably you can adjust the amount you generate minute by minute. You can say,
Yes.
well, let's turn it down a bit. There's less demand. Let's turn it up a bit. There's more demand. So does that still facilitate cheaper prices at night? Because in a way, it sort of feels like it doesn't quite make sense to me. But
Yeah. So there's two parts to the day night issue, and one of it is the generation, as you described.
right,
So we can manage our we can reduce our output of the hydroelectric facilities when demand is lower. So we don't have that pressure. What
yeah,
are we going to do with all this electricity at
yeah,
night? We don't have that pressure today. But as we add more wind generation to the system, then that
right, okay, yes,
that will be something we have to manage.
yeah,
But the other issue about day night is the wires, right?
right,
So we do have we have spare wire capacity on the wires at night, and
right,
that's an important part of the cost of meeting an incremental load like a vehicle charging load. So
right,
if you can encourage and we plan our wires, our transmission and distribution system to respond to the peaks, which and for us the peaks are in the winter, typically between 5 and 7 p.m.
yeah,
at night. And so if we can encourage people not to charge their vehicles in those times,
yeah,
um, then the impact on the wires is much less, and then the investment we
right,
need to make is much less. So that's
right,
really the dynamic that we're paying attention to when it comes to the time of day of
yeah,
people charging. I should also say we are well connected. I think we talked about this last year, to the markets in
yes,
east of us in the province of Alberta, as well as in the United States.
yeah,
And there is at various times of day there is excess energy available on the market.
Right.
Remarkably, given how much solar generation there is in California and the
Yeah.
southwest portion, the cheapest energy is often at 2 PM
Right.
now. And
That's
that's
interesting. Yes.
a change. When I was in that trading business
Yeah.
25 years ago, it was always in the middle of the night, the cheapest
Yeah.
energy. But now it's often in the middle of the day,
Yeah.
before the peak loads at dinner time and before sunset.
Yeah.
That's
That's
when the
really
prices
interesting,
are
isn't it?
highest. So we
Yeah.
try to buy as much of that cheap solar energy
Right.
at in the mid afternoon as we can,
Yeah.
and we use that for our system.
And would you use that as pump storage? Would you use that to pump water up a hill, or because
Yeah,
I remember talking about that with you?
we don't have any pump storage.
Right.
Lots of talk of that, and there's
Yeah.
some really amazing pump storage plants have been built in Europe,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
recently in Switzerland have come online, and that's a really impressive. With our hydroelectric plants, we what we tend to do is we just reduce the
Yeah.
output of the plants in
Yeah.
the off peak times. So when there's energy available on the market, we use that energy to serve our own load, and then we reduce the generation from the hydro plants. So we're
Yeah.
not pumping the water uphill, but we're
Yeah.
saving the water, and
Yes.
that's our form of pump storage, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's how we use the we talk about the hydro reservoirs being like a battery,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's what we mean by that, right? The hydroelectric generator in concert with our load, we can use them together with low price renewable energy when it's plentiful on the market, and
Right.
effectively that becomes a battery.
Right. So what you actually say, so what? Because I think I misunderstood a little bit, but I now get it. So when there is an abundance of solar generated energy from south of you in California and various other states, you can buy that electricity on the market quite cheaply, and
Yes.
that's what you're
Yes.
selling to your customers effectively. It's
Yeah.
not, you're not using it to pump water or anything else. You're
No,
using it to supply
but we're
electricity.
saving the water we have, right?
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
saving the water. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think that was the thing that became abundantly clear to me. I've been to there's a pumped storage system here that we filmed at Norway in Wales, and there's plenty of rain in Wales. It's just that the actual area is quite small. The
Yeah.
size of the lake up the hill. It's not on a Canadian scale. Because when I
Yeah.
looked at the lake, at Revelstoke, you just go, that's a big, big lot of water.
It sure is.
It goes a long, long way. You can. So yes, you don't really need to pump a bit more up. It doesn't really. No. It's not really worth the effort, is it? Yeah, it's a very different thing. And in the long term, then because I think what we're very aware of here is, and it hasn't yet fed through to the consumer, but the general understanding now is that wind energy, in particular in this country, and solar to a lesser extent, is cheaper to generate. And that has now got through. So when we had the big price spike over the last winter, everyone, regardless of what anyone's opinions were, everyone knew it was because of gas. It was because of what happened in Ukraine. It was because of the gas price. And everyone knew that the prices went up because of gas, not because of wind. Because always before that it was, you and your fancy wind turbines, they're costing working people money. And you go, well, they're not. Yeah. But anyway, from your point of view, the infrastructure you've got, which is amazing, the hydroelectric infrastructure. Do you foresee a future where the overall energy prices will reduce? I mean, your electricity is cheaper than ours anyway, but I mean, there's not really so much scope for that. I mean, wind is the obvious potential thing, but if you're not now burning loads of imported coal or imported gas like we would, then you've got that already. It's a slightly different scenario.
Yeah, I mean, we're really conscious about the need to keep the price of electricity affordable for customers, right? And there's the price and there's the bill that they pay. So which is a volume times rate issue.
Yeah.
So we do have a big focus here on energy efficiency with our customers, helping our customers be more efficient so they use less, so they can afford it. they can keep their bills down. And, but as we put more demand on the electric system by converting over from fossil fuels, and then we have to invest in infrastructure, that does put pressure on our rates and our cost structure. And sometimes it's not as obvious to customers who, may be saving money, but they're not putting gasoline in their car, but their electricity bill is higher. Sometimes that's a communication challenge, right? Making that clear to people and thinking about their overall, we call that the energy wallet that people pay. When they're, we want to be really careful there's not significant rate increases occurring, like percentage rate increases occurring here as we invest in infrastructure. So we're doing everything we can to, plan in an orderly way, make good, responsible investments and do it efficiently so that the rates are still in the zone of what people expect. And while we have low rates here compared to other places like California and Europe, when there's a big percentage increase, we don't get any credit for the relative advantage we have. It's just, what do you mean they're going up 5%? That's too much, right? So we have to be very careful about that. And I think governments have recognized that as well, and are interested in supporting the utilities in Canada, finding ways to help utilities bear the cost of the infrastructure required for electrification and climate action. And, typically or traditionally, utilities have funded their investments through their rates, right? And been self-supporting. And I think there's a recognition that as we take on solving, society's bigger problems, whether it's climate change or reconciliation with Indigenous people, just to pick two, governments will have to contribute to that. And so we're looking at mechanisms where they can help fund, this transmission line we're talking about. We're talking about ways that governments could contribute to that, and reduce the impact on our customers in terms of rates. And there's always some multiple pressures on utilities, but when you take your eye off the ball of affordability, that's a problem.
We've certainly experienced that in the in this country. I think I keep being tempted to be more critical of our current administration, but I'm not going to. It's boring. It's been amazing, Chris. Thank you so much for talking to us, because it's such an interesting thing for me to learn, and I hope our listeners and viewers are the same. That the variations around the world of how the energy transition and how energy is changing is just it's fascinating. There's no two areas of the planet that are the same. There's different demands, there's different strains, there's different, and it's really fascinating listening to how you're dealing with all those challenges and opportunities. I mean, I sort of take it that in general you're relatively optimistic about what is happening at the moment.
I am. I mean, I think we can't underestimate how big a shift the energy transition is, right? And it's we're a small corner of the world, right? There's 5 million people here, and mostly, whatever we do here, in terms of emissions, isn't going to affect the larger global situation. But I think we can be an example, and we can show people it can be done. So we take it very seriously. Like, I think if we can't be successful in a relatively wealthy place with lots of resources, like here in Western Canada, then I think we're going to struggle being successful in other parts of the world. So I think it's really important that we show that there's a pathway and show people it can be done. So we take that responsibility very seriously.
Fantastic. And I'm definitely very, very excited about coming to Vancouver again in a few weeks.
Great.
So I'm
look forward to
meeting
seeing you,
there.
Robert.
It's been really good talking to you. Thank you so much for your time today, Chris. So I really hope you enjoyed that. If you're in the Pacific Northwest of the United States or British Columbia or Vancouver Island or all those places, or even Alberta or even Toronto, and you fancy cycling across Canada, I've heard it's not that big. Please do come and see us at between the 8th and the 10th of September at the Vancouver Convention Centre in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's going to be wonderful. It's such a beautiful venue anyway. Even if we just had an empty hall, it would be nice to go and visit it. It's the most amazing venue right on the harbour in Vancouver, stunning harbour. We will let you know more information near the time, but it's looking really, really good. So we're very excited about coming there. And that's all for now. What else is there? That's it. No, I don't want to say anything else. Obviously, you can tell your friends about the Fully Charged Show podcast and you can subscribe, but you know that. So I'll shut up. As always, if you have been, thank you for listening.